here to welcome you to an evening about financial aid. We have Alisa Evans here who I'll tell you a little bit about in a second. I wanted to just mention that our consortium, it's made up of over 50 schools that range from preschools all the way through 12th grade in Los Angeles. And our schools are each unique and different. So our schools have different missions, philosophies, programs, culture. But what's similar throughout all of our schools is really a commitment to financial aid and commitment to having a diversity of economic and financial experiences within our schools. So with that, we're really glad to be able to put financial aid core to what this evening is about because it is core and central to our schools. We're really grateful to each of you families who are taking the time not only to look at our schools, but really taking the time to dive into financial aid and learn about financial aid with us. So thank you for making time for this. On behalf of all LAIS schools, we're really grateful. I want to introduce you to Alisa, who is someone who I have personally learned a lot from over many years. And I know that I'm one of many who feels that way in the admissions and financial aid world. Alisa Evans is the founder of Mission Enrollment, a certified B corporation, and she has more than a quarter century of experience dedicated to fostering equitable access to top-tier education. Her passion's been channeled into creating transformative programs and resources for independent schools and also higher education institutions. She has a strong commitment to ensuring that every child receives an outstanding education. And she's earned trust from over 110 independent and private schools nationwide. And I would say so many more families than that too, as Alisa does a lot of evenings like this for families around the country and consortiums around the country, really helping families work through the financial aid process. Beyond all of this professional piece of who Alisa is, she's a devoted mother of two. She has children 9 and 11, both of whom are enrolled in independent school. And she has a partner, her husband, who works in the community at a local hospital. So Alisa, thank you for this. Thank you for being with us tonight. And again, thank you to all the families who are joining us.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you to LAIS. I have been working with the Los Angeles Independent Schools Group for, gosh, I think it's been 15 years now. And the wonderful part about the LAIS group is that there's a lot of information about independent schools, but as a parent, it can be overwhelming when you're trying to figure out what is the best choice for my child. And they really work as a group. There are so few collective groups of different schools that essentially compete with one another, but actually support one another and say, for the collective good, let's get the right schools for the right kids and making sure we're helping each other, supporting one another. And so I work with schools all over the country, and there are very few that schools that technically compete with each other come together to support parents on how to complete the admissions applications, offer trainings on what, like I'm talking about tonight, about financial aid and how does this process work. Because what there is not a lot of out there, even outside of what LAS is doing, is you can't just YouTube this. Let me get a YouTube video on how to apply to independent schools, or a TikTok about how to do this process. And there's just not a lot of that being offered. So for years, LAIS has really gotten together in the community of Los Angeles to say, let's be a beacon of light. Let's share all the information about independent schools for our families and let them pick the right schools for them in a place that's safe and understanding. And so I've always found it such a joy to present to your group and to your families. And then to all the families out there, as Katrina and I were talking about in the beginning, I so appreciate you showing up on a night after the week of Halloween, before what's coming on with parent-teacher conferences. And I just had a parent-student night, and we are always so busy in the evening. And as we come into the holiday seasons, there's a lot going on right now. So the fact that you're taking the time tonight is just so, I so appreciate that as a parent. What we're going to talk about tonight is about financial aid and how it relates to the independent school world. And, kind of as I mentioned, let me share my screen here quick. What I started to mention is that there is not a YouTube video. There's not TikToks about this. And it's not something that as parents we ever experience, right? So I grew up in Boston and outside of Boston, and so I went to the public school. I did not attend an independent school, and so I did not know enough about this process or really about independent schools until I was getting older and I started going to work for the National Association of Independent Schools. And then this amazing world opened up to me. And once I had children, I'm like, well, I have to send them to an independent school. This is what they get to do is so different and unique and magical. But on the flip side of that, being in the world of financial aid, there is nothing more stressful in a parent's life than talking about their children and their finances. And we get to talk about both of those when we're talking about financial aid. And so our job tonight, and really my goal for you all, is to have you walk away from this with three things. I want you to walk away with a sense of calmness about this process, in that you can do this, you're making a commitment, you're making a very wise financial commitment, you're doing some wonderful work for your children, but just a calmness around, what are the things I have to have in front of me? How do I complete these forms? What am I looking for? What's going to be required of me? And how do you all even come up with these numbers? So a sense of calmness about the process and taking the temperature down. Then I want you to walk away with a sense of clarity around, how do we come up with the numbers that we're coming up with? What is the timelines? What is my responsibility? Because this is a partnership. It's a partnership between the schools and the parents. And we are doing a lot of information on good faith, that you're giving us information that is reliable. And then on the school's part is, we're doing a good job of coming up with something that's fair and equitable, and something that you're going to be able to sustain over not just 1 year, not just 2 years, but be able to pay for your child's education over the course of many years. This is not a, we're going to just do this for 1 year situation. This is something you're considering for many years. So it requires that level of commitment and, kind of parent-school relationship and that partnership. So we're going to do that. We're going to have those two kind of senses about it. And if I've done my job here tonight, you should walk away with a sense of confidence. I can tell you as a parent, from a parent's perspective, my children have been in independent schools here. I live in Southern California since they were 18 months old. And my children are very well prepared for what the future brings for them. I have seen, what we've been through COVID, and the abilities for independent schools to adapt and adjust during that time frame was so incredible, that my children are not in a place that they're as far behind as perhaps other children were. But their resilience, the ability to do different programming. My children are learning much different things than they were learning that the public school was learning. And so the children are going to be prepared for, if my kids go off to college, great. If they go off to pre-entrepreneurs, great. If they go off to the Peace Corps, they are prepared. Independent schools just have a really good pathway for families, and your investment now in their education will pay dividends. The one thing I will also say to you is, you've got calmness, you've got clarity, and you walk away with confidence. That's great. But the one thing you will not walk away with for many years is a thank you on behalf of your children. So I want to thank you on behalf of your children for also showing up here tonight, and even considering this as something for your family, because I am still waiting for that thank you to come. I'm sure Katrina as well is waiting for the thank you from their children on, thank you for investing all this money in me. I often get the crankiness, that doesn't change. They still at times don't want to go to school. And I say, I already paid for this day, so you're going to school. But they will thank you. I know that they will. So we're going to talk through I want to set some kind of ground rules around what is financial aid in the K through 12 world. Because many of us, if you didn't go to an independent school and your family were not on financial aid, the only frame of reference you're going to have is to higher education. And in higher ed, you have the FAFSA, and many of you might be also filling out the FAFSA because you have an older child heading off to college. It's different. The applications are different, and there are more questions. And I want to explain why that is, so that you have better context around what is financial aid in our world, in the pre-K through 12 world, compared to higher ed in filling out the FAFSA. And then we're going to talk about budgeting. And the reason I want to bring up budgeting, not because I don't think everybody is sort of proficient at budgeting, but once you start kind of considering an independent education, you're making you're going to be making different choices. I don't care if you make $100,000, $200,000, $300,000. You are making a choice and sacrifices. People are living paycheck to paycheck at all of those income brackets. I look at 15,000, not me personally, but my team, we look at 15,000 applications of families around the country. And many of us, if all of a sudden we didn't get a paycheck for a couple of weeks, we would be struggling and in trouble. So it's incredibly important to bake this program into your budget and making sure that, when we ask the question on the financial aid application, what do you think you can afford to pay? Doing that household budgeting work beforehand is going to help give you that sense of, I have a good sense of what is sustainable for me as a family and what is unrealistic. And so I want you to do that exercise. One, it's just good to kind of get a sense of things, but two, it will also help you fill out about 80% of the questions on these applications. And so instead of you running around the house or logging into things to say, okay, what do we have? How much are we spending on this? What is our budget here? What are we spending on that? You're going to do that work up front so that you're going to have all the answers ready to go. So when you do log in to complete these forms, you're going to have everything ready to go. I want to give you the timeline that I tend to have our families think through. And again, it's a timeline that is going to be the same timeline for you for the next however many years you're in the program. And so we'll just talk through what are the things that you have to have ready and prepared and by season. And then talking through some of the tax documents. I assume there might be someone on here that's a tax expert, but most of us common folk don't do our own taxes. We use TurboTax or we use a third-party accounting firm to do our taxes. And so when the financial aid platforms are asking for more complex answers, I want to just get you a little bit more familiar with the tax forms you're going to be required to be looking at and giving answers to. And so because the numbers matter, it's important for you to be familiar with these things. And then we're going to leave time at the end to answer questions and get you kind of on your way. So let's just do a quick financial aid 101. What we are talking about tonight is need-based financial aid. And we do that in the form of granting. And so essentially, when you think about higher ed, you might have been given a grant based on the fact that you were a superstar basketball player. And that was based on the merits of the child and had really nothing to do with income. It had to do with the fact that you were a superstar basketball player. And that is not what we're talking about tonight. We are talking about need-based financial aid on your family's ability to pay tuition. So the grant is comprised of, what is the tuition at the school that you're considering, minus what you can afford to pay, and then what is that difference between what the tuition is and what you can afford to pay? That gap is filled by a grant. And so that was how you're able to pay. So if you have a tuition that's $20,000 and you can afford to pay 10, you're going to need $10,000 to fill that gap. Now, the school's not going to say, here's $10,000. Now you give it back to me with your $10,000 to make up the tuition. It's going to be a reduction on your tuition bill. And so that is what a grant is in our world compared to kind of loans and some of the other things that you see in higher education. It's also school specific. So not every school has the same financial aid budget. They don't all use the same financial aid platform. There are 6 financial aid platforms that schools in Los Angeles can use. And it is, kind of the difference between liking Coke or Pepsi. It is personal preference. The calculators are still calculators and they do the same job. It just depends on what school is using other systems. So a school might be using a billing and tuition solution by one company, and they want to stay with that same company to use their financial aid platform to make it, more integrated for families. And then other schools use different systems. So unlike the FAFSA, which everybody fills out the same form, every school could have a different platform. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how you want to make sure you're paying attention to that when you get into, filling out your forms, and that it isn't just I fill out one form and then everybody uses that same form. You might be having to fill out a financial aid form more than one time. And then it's not something that you pay back. It is not a loan. And so I bring this up to be kind of tell you 2 reasons. One, independent schools are independent of any federal funding. And so it's kind of an all for one and one for all, in that fundraising happens, annual giving. Some schools have endowment monies that have been gifted to them from philanthropic people over the years. And that money is then used to cover that grant. Some of it is from their operating budget, but every school is doing this sort of independently. So there's no federal monies coming into the school to fund these programs. So it's not unlimited. It is a limited resource that schools have access to. And that is, then they can come up with their own programs. They're not held to the same, core curriculums. They can do their own curriculums because they are independent. So that's what makes it great. However, because it relies on fundraising, it can't be an unlimited resource. And so once your kids go out into the world, they become these amazing humans doing wonderful things. When they're ready to be philanthropic and look back and decide where they want to give their money to, considering giving money to the independent school that supported them will help generate and continue financial aid programs for years to come. So the financial aid that's being used now has been fundraised for families that came before you. And in order to keep these things running, we're going to have families giving to annual funds so that financial aid can continue on for years to come after your kids are gone from the school. So where do you go to learn about the things? So I want everybody to grab a piece of paper when you're ready to really sit down and think about what schools you're considering. If you've really narrowed your list down of, okay, here are the schools that I'm considering for independent school. I want to make sure that there is the good news is it's consistent. Whatever schools you're considering, go to that school's website. All the independent schools in LAIS have it kind of set up. You can either go to the LAIS website, which has kind of all of the LAIS schools based on different criteria. Find your schools that you're considering. Go to the school's websites, and they all lay out with an admissions tab. Everybody will have an admissions tab, and most of them will have a financial aid section. It might be called financial aid. It might be called tuition assistance. They might even say affording, insert school name, depending on or affordability. But you'll be able to find it in the admissions. It's almost always very close to or next to the financial aid, is always next to the tuition and fees, because it's sort of like, here's the tuition, here's information about financial aid. So go to the school's websites that you're considering. You want to go to the admissions tab, find the financial aid data. What you're looking for is, what is the cost of enrollment of the schools that I'm considering? And look at all the things, the tuition, the fees. Are there any trips that are going to be required of you? Are there any test costs? This will come into play when you start thinking about putting money into your budget for the things outside of tuition that you might have to pay for. So making sure you're looking at the total cost of enrollment. What financial aid platform is the school using? So there are 6 of them. There's Blackbaud, Clarity, FACTS, FAST, SSS, and TADS. So you might be lucky enough that if you put all your kids' names down and say, okay, here are the 3 kids, the 3 schools we're considering, all 3 of them are using Clarity, great, you're all set. You only have to fill out this form 1 time for all of your kids, and then the Clarity system will send them to the schools that you're participating or attempting to apply to. If one of your children is applying to a school that's using Clarity, and then the other school they're applying to is using FACTS, then you're going to have to fill out this form twice. Or you might have, some of the schools are using even a 3rd one. You might even applying to FAST. So you will have to do the form all over again, and the questions are going to be slightly different, but it's all rendering the same data. You're going to still need the same documents and things like that. What will not be universal is the deadline dates may not be universal as to when you need to submit your application for admission and when you have to submit your application for financial aid. So you want to look at the financial aid platform, the documents that are going to be required for that school, and what are the deadline dates. Don't miss out because you thought everybody went with this school's deadline, but then you missed a deadline because someone had an earlier deadline. Make sure you check those. So I say, create that matrix, put the kids' names, the schools you're considering, what are the deadline dates, what are the documents required, and what is the platform they're using. And if you're lucky enough to score everybody's using one system, great. Everybody's having the same similar deadlines, great. What you can also do is just pick a time and say, on Saturday, November, whatever date, we're just going to sit down, get a big cup of coffee, and get all the applications done. While there is no prize for doing your applications early, there is still no disadvantage doing it early. So even if you want to kind of get ahead of things, this is something you can start doing. What you cannot do is wait till after admissions has happened and then you tell the school you need financial aid. it's a simultaneous process. You're applying for admission and you're also filling out the financial aid form at the same time. If you wait until after your admissions has come in, you've already missed everything, and it would be almost impossible for you to be doing a financial aid process after the season is sort of ended. It would be very rare. So make sure you're paying attention. So this is just an example or a sample that a school that has it laid out. So these, when you click on their tuition assistance date, this is when it needs to be in. This is what we're looking for. What are the deadline dates? What is the school code? What system are they using? What documents are required? So every school is going to have this very similar layout where it's going to give you all of those 3 components that you're paying attention to. So do that homework, now, in the next week or so that you're kind of, as you start to narrow your scope on what schools you're considering, that's what you're going to want to be doing, is getting all that details kind of laid out for yourself. All right, so let's talk budgeting, right? I want to give you this as the example because this is, in fact, a screenshot from my own personal budget. And I am happy to make the fool of myself for you. So I am a cautionary tale. I do a very simplified budget. I've been doing a budget since we've had kids in private school because you got a budget for it. And for me, I just find that every year what my husband and I do, in the summer, we download 2 months of bank statements. I categorize all my expenses, and then I just kind of budget. I put them into buckets and see what we're spending. I use 2 months because then I get some good averages. And I use summer months because for us, we don't have any major holidays in there. We don't have any other major expenses coming in that would kind of shift the numbers on what our averages look like. And I just do the categories of, I see it'll come down as what we're, the best thing that came out of COVID, or the only thing that came out of COVID that was helpful, was Instacart and DoorDash. I never realized my world could get free up if I didn't have to go to the grocery store. But it is wildly expensive. But I will look at my budget and see, Instacart, DoorDash, Stater Brothers. So I'll just, tag those all as groceries, and then, housing, transportation, utilities, children's needs. That's one of those things where, like, that's not in a standard budget layout, but there are all these additional things, like my kids keep growing and changing shoe sizes every 5 seconds, it feels like. So we're spending a lot of money there. My son plays hockey, so there's a lot of fees and sports fees associated with that. My daughter plays piano, so there's a lot of, her fees for that. Tuition, I just bake that right into my budget. Thinking about, and do not forget about, things like other expenses related to school. So I already mentioned, make sure you check on things, because my kids' school, they've got, an excursion to Los Angeles, which cost $150 to go do Mexican Heritage Day. So they took the train to LA, and there was a cost associated with that as a parent. So all those little things that are coming up, bake that into your budget. And don't forget about summer, right? Tuition only takes you through the spring, right? You still have to figure out what to do with your kids in the summer. And I'm finally almost at an age where my kids can kind of be here. I work from home, so I'm fortunate in that way. But do I want them here while I'm trying to work? Probably not. So baking in your summer childcare costs into your overall household budget, because that could be 2 more months of tuition payments. So making sure you're really seeing this from a monthly and an annual perspective. Now, this is actually, like I said, a screenshot from my budget. And when I say hope versus reality, I was hopeful that I was only spending $1,200 a month in groceries. But since everything cost a whole boatload more, and I was introduced to DoorDash and Instacart, I was actually spending almost $1,000 more than that. Had I completed the Clarity application and it says, well, how much are you spending on groceries? And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, I think it's about $1,200. And I was really off, like wildly off. And how much were we spending on restaurants? And not really going out to restaurants, but I was sort of thinking in terms of, DoorDash and some of these other things that I'm buying, and I was spending a lot more. So it's a cautionary tale to say, do your budget before you complete the form, because the numbers matter. They do go into the calculators. And so knowing what you're spending is going to be critically important to knowing what you have left over to spend on your child's education. And so doing this budget exercise in the upfront can be really useful for that. Another practical reason, and I joke but not joke, A practical reason to do budgeting, kind of just to do a reset. Now I know that this new thing called Rocket Money can like identify for you when you're paying for subscriptions, because that was also something I found. My 11-year-old son will come to me when I'm very busy and say, "Ma, can I just I just want to watch the Bruins hockey game, and can I just get Peacock for 1 month? It's free for X amount of days, and then I'll cancel it." And I say, "Sure," right? 9 months later, I have been paying, I don't know how many dollars a month for Peacock, but we also have Disney Plus and Discovery Plus and this plus and that plus. And before you know it, I have been spending money on things that I thought months ago my son had canceled and he had not. And so it's a way to reset those things. Or Nintendo Switch, I was paying for some sort of, I don't even know what subscription, that my son doesn't even use the game anymore. But they don't mention to you, hey, it looks like you're not really using this. Maybe we should shut this down. So it gives you an opportunity to even see areas where you can kind of, not that this is not going to, $5 a month is not going to make the difference in my budget, but seeing that over, 8 or 10 different items that I can make impacts and I can make changes to, does help us reset and replan for making sure we're able to cover our kids' tuition. So it's just something that we have done, and I've found it to be really useful and helpful as a reset for the family. So coming into this with a sense of calmness, if you are fully and deeply aware of what's happening in your budget, because of inflation, everything is costing us all more to have about the same stuff, right? So what is the new amount of money you're spending on all the things? I just put some links to NerdWallet, but I really have enjoyed this Rocket Money app, is pretty cool. There's another app called, or a group called You Need a Budget, YNAB, and they pull in all the data for you. And, or you can do what I do, is I go to my Chase account, I download the 2 months of bank statements, and I categorize them by what I know the expense is. And that's about the simplest version of that. But doing that work will help you, A, answer the questions that are going to be coming up, and B, give you that sense of, when you come to the question on how much do you think you can afford to pay, you're going to have a much better sense about that when you've done this work. Gathering your documents. This is really important for people that live in houses that you don't have a lot of extra room for a lot of extra stuff. The minute we do our taxes, I package everything up, off to the storage unit it goes. So if you're going to need access to your last year's tax returns for every application. So your 2022 tax returns, and you may eventually need your 2023s. And if you own a business, you're going to need your corporate tax returns from 2022. So if you do like me and you're putting it in a storage unit or it goes in the attic or somewhere, you want to find that stuff now, get it pulled out, make sure you have all the W-2s for all of your jobs. So a big thing in Los Angeles, for the files that we review, where a lot of folks are doing like maybe commercials or actors, you get like 17 W-2s. We need all of them. And why do we need all of them available to us? Because that's where we're going to see your state taxes paid. We want to make sure we're giving you credit for all of those things. So don't just upload one W-2. We're going to need all of the W-2s. And that's to your benefit, that we make sure we're accounting for your state taxes paid. So make sure you do that work of saying, all right, I'm going to go to the storage unit. I'm going to get all the data. If everything is electronically housed, get copies of your electronic documents. Now, if you use an accounting firm that does your taxes, they will typically send you a password protected version of your tax returns that they filed for you. If that is the case, and you're using a system that's going to require you to upload those tax forms, you need to get a non-password protected version of it. These financial aid systems are not sophisticated enough to take the password off and then let it pass through. So in order to avoid the stress of thinking you've uploaded a document, but really it's a password protected document and your accounting office is closed, make sure you get a non-password protected version of your tax returns. You might be completing this form, like we said, more than one time. So give yourself the time to sit down, figure out the schools you're considering, and then just sit down and maybe just try to get them all done in one sitting. They take anywhere from like 30 minutes, 15 to 30 minutes in the easiest version, all the way up through to an hour. If you own a business, it's going to take longer because there's more complex questions around business owners. So make sure you're just like sitting down to do your taxes. It's going to take some time, and having all those documents sitting in front of you is just going to make that process a heck of a lot easier, so that you're not having to do some of the questions and then log out, go get your documents, log back in again. The more you can just get it done in one sitting, I think the better. So this is your timeline for success. We are well into the fall at this point. So this is the time where you're going to get those tax documents pulled together, do your budget for the year, pull together the deadline dates. If you're a returning family, so say you are already in an independent school, your deadline to apply is typically earlier than new applicants. But so if you're already kind of been in this process, you're going to start filling out these forms really quickly here. And the deadlines are going to be in like November, December timeframe. And then for new families, the deadline to apply for financial aid is typically the same as the deadline for admission. So that's usually in January timeframe. Then by early spring, the school is going to be doing their work to do their assessments, find out what they think you can afford to pay, get all the documents reviewed. And when you get your notification of admission, you're also going to get notification about what your award is going to be, what your grant is going to be. So then you can make an informed decision about what school you're going to assign to, and you'll sign your agreement, your contract. And then by late spring, some of the schools might require current tax documents, and that would be your 2023s after the tax filing deadline, depending on the schools. They might be looking for your current tax documents. And then by late spring, then you're going to be setting up your tuition payment plans. So, and then it's rinse and repeat. Every year, this is the process that you'll go through. And you'll just get used to it, and you'll just keep doing it. And then once your kids are heading off to college, you're going to be a professional at filling out forms. So giving you that sense of clarity or clearness, I wanted to just talk quickly about what goes into these calculators. How do they even come to be? So they break out into three main categories: income, assets, and family members. And so when people will sometimes ask me, well, what is the maximum amount someone can earn but still get financial aid? The problem is it depends. It depends on like a lot of different things. But mostly it depends on things like, what is the size of your family? A family of 4 and a family of 6 have different expenses, and so therefore are going to be asked to contribute something differently. You could also have the same family size, but one family has no assets, and other family is sitting on $1 million in cash in investments. And so it is very much an it depends situation. So why you should apply for financial aid is because you don't think you can afford to pay the tuition, not just for 1 year, but for this year and every year thereafter for the next 8 to 10 or 12 years, depending on what school you're considering. If you do not feel, after you've done your budgeting, that you can afford an independent school paying full price, knowing that tuition will go up every year as everything goes up a little bit every year, anywhere from, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8% every year, depending on the school, then you should apply for financial aid, period. If you don't get offered and maybe they think you can afford to pay full price, then you know your answer, but don't not apply and then you just don't, then you don't pursue it. I would say it's worth pursuing if you think you can afford it. Always worth pursuing. And the way it's broken down and what I think is most important to share with you all is that when we're looking at this, we're essentially looking at the answers to your questions. The reviewers, the school folks, are looking at the answers to the questions that you're answering. We're looking at your tax data, which again is slightly old. And so if there is any time to overshare, this is that moment. Overshare if income has changed. If it's changing because last year you were working and this year there was the writer's strike and you didn't work for 5 months or 8 months, and now you're just getting back into working. The school folks are only as good as the data that's presented to them. And if they don't know that there's been a change of circumstance and we're looking at tax returns from last year, we're not going to be aware that there's been a change. So this is the partnership part where it's really critically important for you to communicate what's going on in your life so that we can do our assessment on the back end. So, but it comes into this basic concept of money coming into the house minus expenses going out of the house. There are things that you have no control over, right? Everybody's got to pay taxes. Everybody's got to pay for housing, clothing, food, insurance. What's left over from those essentials of life is what we call your discretionary income. That is the money you have left over that you can choose to spend on more expensive house, more expensive clothes, going to Starbucks every day, whatever you spend your money on. But one of those things could be non-public education. And so what we're saying is we're asking you to contribute a percentage of your discretionary income to non-public education, not what's left over, or what's left over from this minus this, and everything now then has to go to your kid's education. We still want you saving for your retirement. We still want you making sure that you're covering the day-to-day expenses, but we're asking you to contribute a percentage of your discretionary money to your non-public education, to sending your kids to an independent school. We're looking at assets, but we're also looking at your liabilities. So while you might have a primary residence and you might have a rental property, you also might have student loan debt. You might have past medical debts. You might have other things in there that are also kind of weighed against those liabilities. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at your liquid assets, things like cash in the bank and investments. And then we're also looking at illiquid things like your home, equity, things like that. So we're balancing all of those. And then most importantly, so if you have sold a home or you purchased a home or there's been a change in those circumstances, letting us know about that so that we're aware of that. So if on last year's tax return, you had a rental property, you have since sold that rental property, we need to know about that so we can kind of know that that is no longer an asset of yours. Family members, everyone who lives in your home, we're looking at that from a household perspective. If grandma and grandpa are moving into the home in a couple of weeks, letting us know that they're not going to appear on your tax returns, and we're not going to know that they exist because we don't know you yet. So letting us know if those change of circumstances are happening are going to be really important, because obviously if your household is larger, your expenses for housing, clothing, food, insurance, all those things are going to be incrementally increased by the size of your family. So that's the really kind of, any financial aid platform is looking at all of these same elements. And so you'll notice when you're filling out these forms that the questions are going to be worded fairly similarly, because that's what they're looking at to assess capacity to pay. So what we're going to talk through real quickly is the tax forms that I want you to make sure you have in front of you when you're filling out these forms. So there's going to be questions that are complex, and they're going to say, you know, go to your 1040, which is your personal tax return, and it's going to say, go, you know, what is showing up is your AGI. They're going to use terms that if you're not looking at taxes every day, you know, what is your adjusted gross income? I couldn't tell you what my adjusted gross income is, and I look at taxes all day. People can tell you what they make. If I said to you, you know, what is your earnings every year? What's your salary? People know that number probably, but what's your adjusted gross income is not going to be something that you might just like goes off the tongue pretty easily. So make sure you have your tax returns in front of you so that you can answer those questions, because most financial aid applications are going to say, go to line number 1, go to line number 7. What does the number say there? So you can use those as a tool to complete your form. Now, none of you right now have a 2023 tax return. Nobody does. It's not possible. You're going to be looking at your 2022 tax returns as a guide to complete these forms. So the Form 1040 is your personal tax returns. You're going to want to have a copy of that in front of you. And all of the schedules below that then sort of all that data sort of rolls up to that 1040. And so that's going to have the bulk of the information you need is going to live on that first page of your tax return. And then there's another form called a Schedule 1, which is sort of 2 pages in from your tax return. There's also key information on there that's going to be needed for you, depending on how you're paid. If you own a business and you are a sole proprietor, you will likely have what's called also a Schedule C. You might have 3 Schedule Cs if you have multiple businesses in that tax form. You're going to want to look at each of those, and we're going to need information on each of those different businesses. If you have a more complex business setup, you will likely have what's called a Schedule E. That is used for folks that have businesses, that have trusts, and that have rental properties, or a lot of folks in Los Angeles might even have royalties. Those will all live on what's called a Schedule E. So if you go to grab your tax returns and you think, oh, I'll just need that page 1, make sure you grab the whole copy of your tax return, because there's going to be information that you're going to need to have readily available to you that might live on a schedule, and that's going to be kind of, maybe it could be 5 or 8 pages in your tax return. If you own a business and a more complex business, and you do have a Schedule E, it is likely that you would also have what's called a Schedule K1. And then if you have a corporation, which will have an S on your Schedule E, then you're going to have an 1120S, which is your corporate tax return. And if you own a partnership or you're part of a partnership, you're gonna have a corporate 1065 partnership, and you'll have corresponding K1s. You might have multiple businesses in that fall in that. We're going to need information on each and every one of them. So you might have 3 or 4 K1s. You might have an 1120 and a 1065 because you have different business types. You might also have a Schedule C. So making sure you have all those tax forms in front of you while you're completing this form is going to make it a lot easier for you to complete. If you do own businesses, another thing I want you to be aware of is that you probably should have your profit and loss statement in front of you, because what does not appear on your business form, on your business corporate tax returns, are going to be things like, gross revenues, what are your business assets. Some of that stuff does just not appear on your tax return, but it will appear on your profit and loss statement for income and data and expenses, and then on your balance sheet for your asset side. So we do look at assets and things like that. So making sure you have copies of those in front of you while you're completing the form is going to make it more useful. If you sort of are a classic W-2 family, mom and dad work for, Warner Brothers, and you just get a W-2, then you're going to have your tax return and your Schedule 1, and then you're going to have your W-2s. And like I said, you might have more than one W-2 if you have multiple, if you work for multiple companies and you've been given them. If you are an owner of a business, you might also be W-2ing yourself, and so you might also have a copy of a W-2. So these are the tax documents that are the key ones that you're going to want to pay attention to and have available for you when you're filling out the form. So this is just what they look like. Many of them are similar, but the most important thing that we're going to need information on for almost all financial aid platforms is going to be those wages, right? What are you earning in wages, tips, and other compensation, which is box number 1. And then it might ask you, what are you paying, or what are your Social Security tax and Medicare tax, which is box 4 and box 6. The other questions that you're going to be asked about are going to be asking about, what are you contributing to retirement? Are you doing dependent care? These are all things that, again, if you want to take a screenshot of this, take a screenshot. But the questions are going to be asking you, go to line number 12D, 12. Do you see a D? Put the number here. So as I know this looks a little complex, but just take your time with it. It's going to ask you, it's going to take you down that path anyway. I just wanted to give you, just kind of lay it out for you so you have it. So that's what a W-2 looks like, and sort of the common questions you're going to be asked on the financial aid form for that. Here's a copy of the page, that kind of page 1 of your tax return, your individual tax return. And the most important things that most schools are asking for, and again, you can take a screenshot of this. This is like all the questions you could ever possibly be asked on an application, but this is sort of a secret decoder ring that I share with school folks and parents. But the most important things that we're looking at are, what are the total amount of W-2 wages do you have as a family? That's 1A. No problem. That's pretty straightforward. What is your adjusted gross income? That's line number 11. So you'll say, okay, I got to go to line number 11. Boom, here it is. If you own a business, it's going to start giving you, information on this first page, but then you're going to need to look to those other forms, that Schedule 1, the Schedule C, the Schedule E. So you'll see on your tax return, if you see more numbers than in box 1, then it's going to be a little bit more you're going to need to be doing to completing your forms. So that Schedule 1 is going to give that additional information to say, is it business income? Is it rental or real estate or trusts or royalties or whatever it might be? That's where you'll start looking to see if you don't have that, then it's going to be a lot simpler. So you can take a screenshot of this if you like. This is those kind of additional forms that you might have answers to questions. And what are the corresponding schedules and line numbers? So this is just kind of a secret decoder ring for you. So what if your income is changed? That is when I would recommend you use your last paycheck stub. So it's already November, shockingly. Getting a copy of your last paycheck stub is almost going to be like your W-2, right? We're almost at the end of the year, so you can add another month and see what that looks like. And then you can put that in the if income has changed. A lot of the applications will say, is something changing from last year to this year or this year to next year? You can use that as your guide and then explain what the change has been. Like I said, if you own a business, using your 2022 like profit and loss statement, and then your 2023 year to date. Between those and the balance sheet, you're going to have all the questions to the application that you're going to need to know will live on those things. So we've talked a little bit about all of these things, but using the tax returns as a guide, making sure you itemize things as they come up. If you have unusual situations, leaving good notes. It's that partnership we're talking about. If you are remarried, regardless of who is supporting the applicant child, make sure you lift both of them on your application, because we're looking at the household as a household unit. Money coming into the home, money going out of the house. If we're going to include them in your household as your family size, we need to see that. So most schools will require that. So make sure you just do that in the onset, so you're not having your application put on hold because they're waiting for that information. What do you think you can truly afford to pay? By doing that budgeting work in the front end of this, it's going to help you to complete that question. Don't put zero. Everybody pays something towards tuition. If you are truly at a place that you can't afford, if you can't afford much, just be honest about what you can afford. Sometimes folks will put the full tuition in that question. And that's because the question is very close to what is tuition. So pay attention to questions around what do you think you can afford to pay and what is the estimated tuition. People switch that question around all the time. Clearly, you wouldn't be filling out an application for financial aid if you could afford to pay full price. Be careful of double entry. That's really important. And then the last thing I'll talk about is sort of divorced and separated families. Make sure you complete the forms separately. If you are living in separate households, we want you to separately complete these forms. And if you are actually divorced, then you're going to be completing separate forms. You're not going to be sharing information and putting it on one form. You'll each complete your own form, and then the systems will put the data together to say, okay, this is Johnny's mom, this is Johnny's other parent, this is the same family, and then it'll pull the data together for the school on the back end. But we don't want you trying to squish 2 households worth of information onto one application. What is the expectation around working parents? And what if I'm a stay-at-home parent? You can certainly be a stay-at-home parent. Most schools will add income to the non-working parent unless you qualify under these other circumstances. So the exception to that rule, and it's important that I talk about this because if you are the exception to the rule, then you need to make sure you let the school know that. So as they're doing their assessment, they're aware of your circumstances. So if you are a stay-at-home parent and you are caring for an elderly child, a disabled child or an elderly parent, that is your job. That is what you're doing. You are unable to work outside of the home because of this circumstance. That is perfectly acceptable. That is the job that you're doing. Because really the expectation is that parents are going to do all that they can do to come up with all the money they can come up with for independent school, including, reaching out to your resources, grandma and grandpa, whatever your resources are first. Then you're coming to the school saying, we've done all the things we can do, and now we're asking the school to help us. But if one of those parents cannot work, then they cannot work. So caring for an elderly parent or a disabled child. If you are a parent of a non-school age child, so you just had a little, it's generally a lot of families, it's cheaper for one parent to stay home until that child is able to go to school. And so if you have a little at home, and that is why you're staying at home, that's why you're staying home. If you have just lost your job, you are not a stay-at-home parent, you are an unemployed worker, and that you are just currently in between jobs. Letting us know that, we'll understand what the state of affairs are, what the circumstances are. Or if you are actually unable to work due to a disability or some other circumstance, just make sure you're clear in your directions and giving the school your story, what's happening. These are mathematical equations, but there are humans attached to them and little humans attached to them. And we are reading those, what you say. And so we use the math as a guide, but we also use your story as a guide. And so giving both of those to us helps us to understand the full picture of your household. And that, as we've all learned, you do have to apply each and every year. Okay, I wanted to make sure I left some time for us to have questions as they've come up. And fortunately, the good news about, doing an anonymous webinar is that, it protects your information, but you can't just open up the thing and ask questions using your, we can't unmute you. So we want to keep you anonymous, but put your questions, if you have any, in the Q&A. And then we can, and I know Katrina's been answering questions along. Maybe there are some questions that, if one person asks it, it's probably a question lots of people are thinking about. So I'll have you all, I'll just kind of, give you that opportunity. But before we even get into the questions, again, I just want to, this is a lot of information in a short period of time. I just want to take this back to the fact that as parents, this is something that I so appreciate you taking the time to listen and learn. It is an investment that you're making, and it is absolutely a sacrifice. And I would never suggest otherwise. You have choices what you spend your money on, and this is just one of many choices that you have to make. But I can tell you confidently, because I have no dog in this fight, and that I am confident that the decision that you're making, even to consider an independent school, will be a good investment in your child's education. It will have long-term implications for them that will have long-term success. I encourage you to ask all the questions. Find the school that's the right fit for you first as a family, then looking at the finances of it, because you want to find the right school for your child, basing it on all the things that are meaningful to you as parents. But I just want to thank you for, even joining us and participating in such a way, because it is a big decision for you to make. It's a big investment. And just thank you on behalf of your children, because I know they're not going to thank you anytime soon. All right, so now we'll open it up for any questions along the way. And Katrina, I don't know if you have any other kind of closing
Thank
thoughts.
you, Alisa. No, this has been wonderful. And as I said at the beginning, I always learn a lot from you. So thank you. There's a number of questions in the Q&A, and I'm not going to reply. I'm not going to mark them here just so that they can remain anonymous.
Yes.
But one of the questions was just a kind of nuts and bolts question about, can you share the slide deck? And I wanted to let families know that within a week, this webinar the recording will be posted to the Los Angeles Independent Schools website. So you'll be able to access the recording. There's a question about credit card debt. And if you can talk a little bit, Alisa, about how credit card debt might be considered in the process.
So there's a couple of things, and it because there are different platforms that are looking at different components. The question is going to be there on every application. Do you have credit card debt? What is the amount of credit card debt, and what are the balances owed? And that is going to be a question on, I think, almost every application. How it's taken into consideration of what you can afford to pay is a lower priority consideration above other things like housing, insurance, taxes, all of those things. Do schools look at that? Absolutely. If you have an instance or a situation as to why you have maybe sizable credit card debt, and maybe it was due to, like, I have a daughter that has dyslexia, so maybe we had to, buy some programs and services on a credit card, and that is why, then that's something you want to share. But sort of general credit card debt would be part of that discretionary money that you pay out of your own discretionary money. And so while it is reviewed and seen, it is not a major factor in what the families and the schools will suggest you can afford to pay. Because while, yes, everybody has choices about what they're spending their money on, we couldn't go through and say, well, your credit card debt is more noble than somebody else's credit card debt. So they tend to look at it kind of as a that's an expense that you have, that's something you're going to be kind of on your end. We're going to be looking at your income minus those critical core expenses of housing, clothing, food, insurance, and then whatever you're paying on your credit card debt is sort of out of your discretionary monies as well. So it'll be asked. So I would also make the recommendation that you get copies. Like, go to all of your bank accounts or your credit cards, get your most recent bank statements, get your most recent credit card statements, but also the big one right now, many of us have not had to make payments on our student loans. What is your current balances on your student loans? What is the new monthly payment going to be? Because that's all kind of newly happening. That is being taken into consideration in many financial aid platforms. So while credit card is sort of on the kind of a different end of things, student loan debt for many of us parents is a pretty sizable piece of our monthly bills. So do that. That's another thing I would say, spend some time getting your current debts on that, because for many of us, it's been zero monthly payment. So you might even forget what the monthly payment might look like. So that's just another expense to pay attention to.
Thank you, Alisa. We have a lot of questions and 2 more minutes of our webinar, I'm realizing. So I'm going to try to give a few different types of questions, and then I want to encourage families who are on this webinar, please, 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 there is always at least one, but usually many people at each school who really want to talking about financial aid. And some of the questions that I might not throw your way right now, Alyssa, are because they
Any school
really
could answer,
vary
yeah.
school to school. So it's important to ask them of individual schools. A question a family had is, if you apply for a certain amount of assistance, can it be rejected completely, or can a portion of your request be granted? Like if you, I think the person's asking, like, if you're saying that your family would need $20,000 of tuition assistance, but would the school offer 10,000, or would they just say we don't have 20,000 or you don't qualify?
That's a good question. And I hate this, but it's always it depends. It depends on the school's philosophy. So, it's a conundrum that a lot of schools find themselves in. If they are out of money, right? So they've given all of the financial aid that they can give, and your family needs 20,000. Do they say, yes, your child got in, but you can't afford it? So how are you going to figure it out? I don't know. Or do they say to you, you know what? Unfortunately, your child did not get in. And it probably, it could have been because of financial circumstances. It could have been other reasons. And so each school has to make that choice on, do they tell families? There are some schools that will do what's called a financial aid wait list, whereas, families say no to one school or yes to another school, it might release funds and then they can kind of give it to the next person on the list. But I would not use that as the reason not to apply, not to look into it, and to ask the questions. But gapping families is not a common practice in our world. Like in higher ed, there's more of that happens. I think schools want to be able to serve you completely. So I just don't think they do a lot of that. Well, I know you need 20, but I'm going to offer you 10. That is very rare that I would say a school would do that. So I think you just got to, go with your gut. And then frankly, if you got to go with what you can afford too. So you always, I would say there's no straight answer to that question, but you're going to likely get what you need. And it would be rare that a school would say, I can give you half of what you need. I don't see too much of that happening.
Last question. Well, can I ask two more
Yeah,
questions from the
absolutely. Yes.
Q&A? Is that okay? Okay,
Yes.
there's one that's I think a pretty quick answer of, if you're pregnant but won't technically yet have a child in the world when you're filling out the form, can you say your child has a sibling? And I think thinking about how dependents are considered in financial aid.
That's a good question. So you would not list them yet. You wouldn't list them on the application as a dependent, because they are not technically a dependent of your household yet. What I would do is I would have you list them on the other. There's a section at the end of every application is like, is there anything else we need to know? And that would be an absolutely appropriate place to say, hey, great news, we're going to be having a child in February of 2024. We don't currently have a child yet, but in February of 2024, we're going to be having a baby. Now, any reviewer, a financial aid person, would then look at that, and they would likely increase the family size come from, they would know you by then probably. But that way it's, we don't do a lot of things on fears and hopes and not realities of the moment. Just like if you're saying, I'm worried I'm going to lose my job in February of 2024, that might happen, but it might not happen. So we try to do things based on sort of current and the past, but letting us know what you're anticipating for the future. So I would list it as, we are, hopeful to welcome a child in February of 2024, but they are not currently a dependent of your household for tax purposes, or even for, for the financial aid application. So I would say you wouldn't list them right now, but you would just let the school know that you are. And then by the next year's application, your family size would change anyway. But yeah, depending on the school, that would. But I wouldn't list them as a dependent yet.
Great, thank you. Last, there's a couple questions here about how you're kind of showing things that aren't on your tax return. So do you show proof of income? Do you show stock market investments? How do you, someone said, how do you
like prove it or disprove
prove it,
it?
basically?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when I said this was a partnership, it is very much based on good faith, in that schools nor parents have the time generally to submit 18 different, bank statements and all this kind of stuff. When we ask you, what do you have in the bank? and you say $10,000 or $2,000, we're probably going to take that on faith, right? There's not a lot of schools that are going to say, I want, 18 months of bank statements to prove that, because on any given day, it could be different, right? And so we're looking for a lot of averaging and averages. And so unless it's wildly out of the ordinary, then the school is likely just going to take your answer on that good faith, right? Investments, some schools might ask for investment portfolio, like your year-end investment portfolio, but again, that's not common unless it's really out of the ordinary, or we think you made a mistake and you put an extra zero at the end of something. Then we want to make sure we validate that or that. The vast majority of the documents that we're going to require from you are going to be tax related, tax documents, and the rest of it, unless it's again out of the ordinary or doesn't make sense. So if your income is showing that you make $60,000 a year, and then you're telling me that you have $800,000 in your checking account, I would say, what on earth are you doing? Because I want to do that. How do you make 60,000 but also then have $800,000 in the bank? That might be out of the ordinary, that it wouldn't make. Did you really mean to say that, or was that a mistake? So the vast majority of documents you're going to see requested are going to be 1040s, W-2, business taxes. And then, unless there's some reason to look otherwise, that's pretty much what the schools are looking for, is that kind of good faith data.
Thank you, Alisa. And again, it's hard for us, I think, to leave some questions that are really good questions unanswered, but I want to appreciate you, Alisa, for sharing with all of us tonight. And again, on behalf of the Los Angeles Independent Schools Consortium, I want to thank all of the families who have joined us. I want to highlight a couple upcoming LAIS webinars. So we have next week, November 14th, a roadmap to kindergarten admissions webinar, and that is going to be, you'll be joined by a number of kindergarten admissions directors, and it's really a panel to learn a little bit more and then ask your questions. And then we have a more general K-12 independent schools webinar on December 5th. Those events and registration are all on the LAIS website. Thank you, thank you, thank you for spending your time with us. And please, I want to underline as many times as possible the request that with your questions, please do ask of whether it's the financial aid offices or the admissions offices or the finance offices. Find that person and ask for help to find that person at each school who loves talking about financial aid, and they will answer your questions in a way that's going to support you in the process at that specific school. Have a wonderful evening, everyone, and thank you, Alisa.
Thank you, Trina. Thank you, everybody. Good luck and have a wonderful season. Bye now.